Hello, Dr. Graham and our listeners. How are you today, Professor?
I'm doing well. How are you?
We're doing okay. Welcome to Podcast for Tomorrow. Today we'd like to introduce our guest, Dr. Michael Graham. Before we get started, we would like to share with you a brief background of Dr. Graham. Dr. Graham earned his PhD in European history from the University of Virginia in 1993. After earning his PhD, he taught in South Carolina at Coker College before coming to the University of Akron in 1995. At Akron, he has held several administrative positions, including Director of Graduate Studies. He has written 2 books on European history, including the award-winning The Uses of Reform, Godly Discipline and Popular Behavior in Scotland and Beyond, 1560 to 1610. In addition to his 2 books, he has published many articles, won numerous awards and fellowships, and presented at conferences in North America and Europe.
Hello, I'm Jack. I'm in 7th grade and attend Beechwood Middle School. I am interviewing Dr. Michael Graham. Hello, Professor. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you choose to get a PhD in history?
I've always liked history, for one thing. When I was in college, I actually was not a history major. I was an English literature major, history minor. And one of the reasons I became a history minor was along the way, I took some courses in European history and really loved the way the professors taught them, one professor in particular. And that was a time in my life when I was kind of wondering what I would end up doing as a job once I finished my studies. And watching him, I thought to myself, I think I could do that. I think I would like to do that. And I also spent some time hitchhiking, traveling around Europe one summer while I was in college, and became particularly interested in Scotland. And I thought, well, if there's a way I can find a profession in which I can teach and travel, I'd like to do that. So that's what led me to get a PhD in history.
Okay. Any advice for students who love history as they move through secondary school?
Well, nowadays it's very important to try to get some experience along the way. Now, in middle school and secondary school, a good way of doing that would be to look into local history sites. In this part of Ohio, we have things like Hale Farm and Village. Up in the Cleveland area, you have the Western Reserve Historical Society. And visit those places and talk to some of the people who work there. And you may find also that there are volunteer opportunities or projects that you can get involved in, because increasingly people who study history in college and in graduate school are moving into what we call public history fields. So they're working in museums and in archives and on various historical sites, as well as doing things like teaching at the college or university level. So go out and look around and try to get some of that kind of experience.
Thank you. The Black Death ravaged Europe from 1348 to 1350. It brought great questions about life and what it has to offer. Society began to change drastically from this event. We learned about the Mongols and how cultural diffusion brought the Black Death to Europe. Could you tell us some more information about that?
Well, the ancient home of the Black Death, as far as we know, is in Central Asia. The Black Death itself is actually believed to be caused by a bacteria, which is called, I'm going to spell it out for you here, Yersinia, Yersinia pestis. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yersinia pestis. I'll hold it up in case you're wanting that for longer. Yersinia pestis is a bacteria which thrives in black rats and also the fleas which bite the black rats. And it's among those black rats, it is seen as being not an epidemic disease, but an endemic disease. And what it means to be endemic is that it frequently strikes, but it doesn't strike in such a dramatic way as to kill off too much of the rat population or too much of the flea population. So it doesn't have a big effect on their populations. Among humans, when Yersinia pestis afflicts humans, it becomes epidemic. That is, it has a dramatic impact on human populations because, and although it's still around, as a matter of fact, humans don't deal with it very well. We now have medical treatments for it, so if caught quickly enough, or if you get treatment quickly enough, it's not generally fatal today. But it can still have a dramatic effect on a human body. What I thought I might do, if you want, is actually describe the process by which people in the Middle Ages caught the Black Death, contracted the Black Death, and the effect that it had on them. Is that what you would like me to talk about?
Yes,
or
please.
Was that a yes?
Yes, please.
Okay. The best horror stories are often real horror stories, and this is pretty much a horror story. First of all, the way rats, there were these particular rats with these particular fleas carrying this particular bacteria, got to Europe is probably something you've studied and know something about. The trade routes, the Silk Road, and eventually through those sorts of contacts in 1346, I believe, the plague reached Sicily, and from then it gradually spread to pretty much all of Europe, with the exception of Finland and a few isolated places within the next 5 years or so. Now, picture this. A flea bites a rat. Now, rats tended to live around humans. They still sometimes live around humans, in part because they eat some of the same food that humans eat. And in the Middle Ages, that was particularly grain, wheat, barley, rye, things like that, which the rats ate and the humans ate. And so there'd be granaries, grain stores, bags of grain, things like that around where people were, and so rats would hang around those areas as well. And rats could travel on ships along with bags of grain, and people traveled on these ships and so on. So what happened is, let's say a rat was suffering from the plague, and a flea came and bit it. The fleas normally live off the blood of the creatures they bite. So in this case, a flea bites rat. And the rat happens to have Yersinia pestis, this bacteria, in its bloodstream. And as the flea starts sucking the blood of the rat, the bacteria gets into the digestive tract of the flea. Now, a flea has a tiny digestive tract. So, and this bacteria multiplies very rapidly once it gets a new host. So, imagine like the throat and the esophagus and the stomach of the flea just filling up with this expanding bacteria while the flea is trying to suck the blood of the rat. It can't get enough blood because of all this bacteria that's expanding in its digestive system. So the flea remains really hungry, despite the fact that the flea is feasting on the rat. Now, the rat may itself be dying as a result of the disease. Whatever the case, the flea quickly decides that the or perhaps a human. In that case, the flea might bite the human, and of course the flea still has all this bacteria in its digestive system, and the flea sinks its teeth into the human, starts trying to suck the blood of the human, but because of all this stuff in the flea's digestive system, it can't so much swallow the human's blood as it instead tends to throw up this bacteria. And as a result, the bacteria gets into the bloodstream of the human who is being bitten by the flea. So what happens then is the bacteria starts multiplying in the human's bloodstream and quickly gets to the human's lymph nodes, under their arms, sometimes in their neck, sometimes in the groin area, tops of the legs. And that's where these things called buboes would develop, basically just tremendous swellings in those parts of the body. And 80% of the people to whom this would happen would be dead within 3 days. That's how fatal this disease is in humans, and that's one of the reasons it is epidemic in humans rather than endemic. So you get this, what to Europe in the 14th century seemed to be a new disease. Although this is something that historians now debate. It's possible that the plague had been to Europe before this, but it hadn't been there for a long time. So you get this dramatic population loss. As you guys know, probably something like between a third and a half of the European population died within that 5-year period as a result of this. Now, there's another form of the plague that also developed. The process I've been describing to you is the bubonic plague. And that was the way it tended to strike first. And it particularly tended to strike that way in the warmer time of year, spring, summer, fall, because that's when fleas are out and about and people are out and about more. And there's another form of the plague that developed, which is called pneumonic plague, and I'm going to spell that out for you also. I'll spell mnemonic for you. See that? That's pneumonic. Pneumonic plague you would get when someone who had contracted the plague started coughing. You all know what it's like in the wintertime. A lot of people have colds and they start coughing on each other. Someone suffering the plague often had a lot of blood in their lungs. And if such a person coughed, someone else in the vicinity, in the same room, and keep in mind that most people lived in dwellings that would only have one room in them, so you could drown your other family members quite a bit. One of them coughed on you, and some of these blood droplets, which you couldn't even see, they were so small, were in the air. You might inhale one of those, and you would then contract the plague pneumonically. And the pneumonic plague would kill people much more quickly. Often within 24 hours, you would be dead. And whereas about 1 in 5 of the people who contracted the bubonic form would survive, the pneumonic form was pretty much always fatal. So that was actually the most devastating form of the plague. It could be more common in winter months when people were spending more of their time indoors, coughing more in close proximity to each other.
Is there any historical evidence that the Mongols used biological warfare in Kaffa that might have helped spread the plague?
There's no evidence of that I know about. And I would tend to doubt it, in part because people didn't know very much about how the plague spread. We know, and I should also point out that this is something else that some people debate. There are those who say that the Black Death could not have been caused by Yersinia pestis, and they argue that it was a virus instead, something along the lines of the Ebola virus, which struck in Africa in recent years. Most historians don't buy that theory. Most historians say that it was Yersinia pestis. And Yersinia pestis was isolated as a cause of the plague in the late 19th century. In fact, it has its name because of a doctor, I believe his first name was Alexander Yersin, who identified the bacteria. So it was only then, in the late 19th and then early 20th centuries, that people figured out how the Black Death spread. In the time that the Black Death first struck, in the middle of the 14th century, the most common theory for what caused it was what was called the miasma theory. I'll spell that out for you. Miasma. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And a miasma was essentially just kind of a cloud. It was thought that there'd be like a cloud of bad air around people who had the plague, and that the plague would move that way. There were also theories that maybe it came in the water, and there were also theories that because in the Middle Ages, people in Europe, most of the population of Europe was Christian, and there were strong prejudices against...
Noah Morgan to the office with your items to go home, please.
Apologize.
A brief commercial interruption.
Right.
And so because of these views, these very prejudiced views against Jewish people, there were also, sometimes when there'd be an outbreak of plague, people would say, oh, the Jews must have caused this, and they would attack their Jewish neighbors if they had any. Many didn't have any. So that was another theory that was current in the 14th century about what caused the plague. But in fact, people didn't really know, which is why I would find it doubtful that the Mongols would have been able to use it as a tool of biological warfare.
Okay.
What percent of the Jewish population and other minority groups were killed in the Black Death?
My hunch is, I don't have any reason to doubt this, that Jews died in the same proportions as everyone else from the Black Death. So in that case, probably about a third to a half of the Jewish population would have died. A third to a half of the Muslim population would have died. There were Muslims in what is today Spain, for example. And a third to a half of the Christian population would have died. There is one interesting aspect to this if you look at death rates, and that is that the plague was apparently it killed people at a higher rate in rural areas rather than in cities, which kind of doesn't make sense when you first think about it, because we would think that as a disease that travels, from rats to humans and so on, and sometimes from humans to humans, that it would be more common where you had greater concentrations of people and rats, i.e. in cities. But in fact, it appears that people in cities maybe developed a little more of a cold-hearted attitude about things, and they tended to stay away from people who they knew were suffering from the plague. Whereas in small farmsteads and rural villages, people tended to cling together more. And that's probably the reason that the death rates were a bit higher in rural areas than in cities. But mind you, at this time, somewhere between 90 and 95% of the European population lived in rural areas. Cities were very small. In the long run, the difference, and death rates didn't make that big a difference.
We learned about how the Black Death impacted the feudal system, manners, art, and religion. So we have 10 minutes for the following questions, and hope it will help us clarify these effects.
Okay. So why did the Black Death cause people to want to move into cities, and what impact did this have on the manners?
I heard the first part. Your first question was, why did it cause them to want to move to cities?
Yes.
Is that okay? And what was the second part of the question?
What impact did this have on the manners?
Okay. I'm not sure it really caused people to want to move to cities. It did cause people sometimes to flee the places they came from. So, you know, if the plague broke out in your village, you might run away. And because villages were places where everyone knew everyone, and it was very
Nia
important.
Patrick, please report to advisory. Nia Patrick, please report to advisory.
And it was very important for you to be from the village, to be accepted in the village. So it would be kind of hard if you fled a village, say because of the plague, to settle in another village, because people would be suspicious of you as an outsider. Cities, on the other hand, were kind of, you know, they had more people in them. They were a little more anonymous in that sense. So,
Chadley, please report
for that
to
reason,
advisory.
you could probably, that might encourage you to end up in a city if you had fled a village. So that might have encouraged people to go to cities. Now, the manorial system, here's where, while the Black Death initially was a horrible thing, in the long run, it really improved the standard of living for the average European peasant. Because what happened was, the people who owned the manors, the lords, needed labor. They needed people to work on their land. And before the Black Death, Europe was relatively overpopulated for the resources it had, for the food that it could produce. And so people were afraid to leave their land because they were afraid they wouldn't be able to find a plot to farm anywhere else. That was before the Black Death. After the Black Death, there was such a shortage of labor that the landowners had to offer people better terms to get them to come and work the land for them. So it became what we would call a seller's market for labor, where the people selling the labor, i.e. the laborer, the peasant, was in a much better position than he had been before the Black Death. And in fact, the long-term population history of this is rather interesting. The initial impact of the Black Death, as you know, killed a third to a half of the population. And then after that, it continued coming back every few years, not as dramatically, but it meant that population continued to decline slowly. And it wasn't until around about the 1470s or 1480s that it started growing again across Europe. And it wasn't really until sometime in the late 1600s that it reached the level that it had attained before the Black Death.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We know that during the Black Death, an art called Death Macabre came into society. And we know that the plague lessened the power of the church. Could you explain in what way and how much the population this affected?
I'm having a hard time hearing you. You said something about the church, but what did you say before that?
We know that during the Black Death, an art called Death Macabre came into society.
Okay.
How did that art represent the people's situation?
Well, the Black Death, because it was so dramatic and so sudden, and you know, it was so unknown before this, it really shook people up. And while life expectancy, even before the Black Death, wasn't nearly what it is today, having this sudden new disease appear really scared people and reminded them that people could die at any moment, because literally that's what happened with the Black Death. And as a result, there was an increased emphasis on being ready to die at any moment, getting your affairs in order, making confessions, doing penance, because that was considered to be very important for the salvation of your soul. So you would get in paintings and things of that nature representations of skeletons, the so-called dance of death, or the danse macabre, as you referred to it. And that was there as a reminder. Those things were there as reminders to people that, hey, be ready because you could die at any moment.
And did that lead to the lessening of the church's power?
Actually, I suspect that increased the church's power. Now, there are various ways in which it affected the church. In some ways it would have harmed the church's power. In some ways it would have increased the church's power. But people feeling that they always needed to be prepared to die tended to increase the church's power, because that would mean that people would have more interest in seeking the sacrament of penance, for example. Now, there are ways in which it hurt the church's power, because the church was also a big landlord. The church owned a lot of land, and just as noblemen found now they had to pay more for labor and had to give better deals to their tenants, their renters, so the church found the same thing. So it could go both ways.
Okay. After the Black Death, Europe headed toward the Renaissance. I have a few questions about that in the modern world.
Okay.
A surplus of food is a requirement for an army and cultural growth. What advantages made cities like Florence, Italy, to become a center of trade?
Florence is an interesting case because Florence actually recovered from the Black Death much more quickly than other cities. I don't entirely know the reasons for that. Some of it may have just been geographic luck, where Florence was located. It wasn't a major port city, so it might not have been hit as dramatically by the plague in the first place. But we do know that Florence's population had recovered to pre-plague levels by the early 1400s. Florence was a center of the banking industry. The Medici family, as you probably know, had its base in Florence. Having some prominent citizens who were pretty wealthy meant, and those people would want to make their mark on the city by founding schools, endowing churches, commissioning sculptures, and things like that. And that really helped Florence grow in a big way in the early and mid-1400s. But I think part of it is because, in terms of population, Florence got a bit of a head start. It recovered from the plague more quickly than some of the cities that might have been its competition, like, for instance, Naples, which was a port city and which was one of the first places that the plague hit.
Okay. Why does trade and cheap labor build cities and empires better than a nation providing for itself with fair wages? Today, China is gaining wealth because of trade and cheap labor.
Well, I think the jury's out on that, but it is true that in Europe after the Black Death, you actually had not such cheap labor anymore. You had more expensive labor because people had more options. And in the aftermath of the Black Death, cities started growing again. So that would, that would not necessarily support the idea that cheap labor enables cities to grow. Now, it is true that on any particular building project, cheap labor is helpful and makes the project less expensive. This was a period, or at least the period before the Black Death, as you probably know, had been a period of major construction of cathedrals. And most of those projects came to a halt with the Black Death. But the skills of the masons, the people, the stoneworkers, the people who built those cathedrals, while many of them died in the Black Death, those that survived often found employment later on building, for instance, the city halls, the merchant halls of in the Low Countries and in some of the Italian cities. And they were probably getting paid more for their labor than they had been before, simply because there was more labor was scarcer, and therefore people had to pay more for labor.
Okay. Well, we have to start wrapping this up. Is there anything you would like to add about the Black Death and Renaissance?
Well, I would like to, part of this I've already said, that while the Black Death refers to a particular visitation of the plague in Europe in the middle of the 14th century, it did keep coming back. And at particular times, it had a big impact. You may have read about or know something about the plague in London in 1665 and 1666, for example, which had a fairly dramatic impact on London life. And, of course, in the immediate aftermath of that visitation of the plague, much of the city of London burned down in the Great Fire of 1666. Plague became a more local thing after the mid-14th century. Particular cities would occasionally be hit by plague, and it could really mess things up for them. The last major European plague outbreak was in the port city of Marseille in southern France in 1721. It was, I guess almost 300 years ago that the plague was last a major factor in a European context. But plague still breaks out every now and then. There was a plague outbreak in India in 1993. There are occasional isolated cases of plague in the southwestern United States. No, it's not entirely gone. Wash your hands.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for this wonderful interview, Dr. Michael Graham. It has been a very pleasant experience, and I will remember this for a long time. This interview has given me a more in-depth understanding of the Black Death and the people at that time.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it too, and I hope I haven't rambled too much.